Welcome to IVF This, episode 46, When You Feel Like a Failure. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I'm so excited to talk with you all today. Recording these podcasts is probably one of my favorite things to do in a week because it really does feel like we get to have a conversation. I realize that the conversation only exists in my head, and I'm perfectly fine with that, but it always feels like it's our time to connect and show up for each other, which I absolutely love. Now, writing the podcast is usually pretty painful for me. I have a lot of mind drama, the same kind of mind drama that you guys have when you have a deadline looming, right? I hem and I haw around, do some online shopping, play around on social media. Maybe I'll get a text from my wonderful producer, Anthony, gently reminding me to get the episode to him for production and edits. But of course, once it's written and I'm sitting at my desk, I'll picture all of us sitting around sharing stories, talking, building each other up. And it just makes me feel so squishy inside. I love it. Lately, I have been getting a lot of DMs on Instagram from listeners reaching out and thanking me for the podcast and just sharing how impactful it's been. And ladies, I've got to tell you how much my heart swells when I get these. Of course, it's lovely to hear when people appreciate your work, but more than that, I just love knowing that someone out there is suffering just a little bit or even a lot less than they were before. Oh my gosh, that is everything. That is the name of the game right there. So I have an ask for each and every one of you. If you love this podcast and it is helping you, please share it. If you're in any of the Facebook IVF or infertility groups, share it there. Talk about the impact it's had on you. If you're in support groups, either impersonal or virtual, talk about it there. Tell your OBGYN or your reproductive endocrinologist about it so that they know that there is a resource out there for their other patients. If you're meeting up with a group of friends, maybe that you've made along the journey, talk about it with them. The sky's really the limit on how you can spread the word about this podcast. I'm sure I've talked about it before, but I really feel like IVF This is a revolution. There's so much despair and hopelessness, pity and resentment, and all the emotions that are tied up in this experience. And we're changing that. Even you sitting there, listening, absorbing, you're changing your experience of infertility and IVF. You're showing yourself as an example of what is possible to the rest of the world, that you don't have to stay stuck in the old model of being disempowered and alone. So please share that. I would love for you to share the podcast and give someone else a chance to feel empowered and less lonely. Okay, so let's talk about something that comes up time and time again. And I'm not just talking about with my clients, although we talk about it together too, but very often I see it on Instagram and Facebook in the support groups and even on personal pages and things like that. And it's this idea of being a failure. I think we can probably sum it up with one phrase that, whether it exactly matches what we've said or it's a pretty close association. And the phrase is, my body can't or won't do the one thing it's supposed to do. Oh my gosh. This phrase makes me cringe so much, mostly because it was something that I said to myself, my husband, my friends, pretty much anyone who would listen to me during those first few years of infertility. It was like this scarlet letter, the other F word, frankly, much worse. And for those of us that carried around the scarlet letter, it felt much like Hester Prynne felt walking around that colony after being branded an adulteress. It feels that isolating. It feels that alienating. It feels that ostracizing. Yes? No? I'm not sure if that's the correct word, but I would hate to lose the rhythm of all three ings. Now, the idea of being a failure, quote unquote, right, isn't exclusive to infertility. Most everything that we talk about has a much broader context because of how we do one thing is generally how we do most things. But let's say that you're an extremely high achieving woman and that this is the first time you've come up with something or come up against something really that you haven't automatically, or even what you would have decided would be a semi-reasonable amount of time, haven't achieved. Maybe you have very perfectionistic tendencies, and so things that you had planned and expected for your life look much different. And you use that as a way to call yourself a failure because for you guys, if it's not perfect, then it's terrible. I'm thinking of that TikTok and the Instagram audio that says, repeat after me. If it's not right the first time and it cuts to it's shit, I'm shit, right? That is kind of the perfectionistic fantasy. Maybe the idea of going from trying to naturally conceive or spontaneously conceive to any medical intervention by you is deemed a failure. Sometimes going from IUI to IVF can be deemed a failure. There's a personalization that we do, that we kind of create around a cycle failing, a transfer failing, whatever expectation is not being met, right? We amount that to us being a failure. That's the personalization aspect. All of these things are examples of how we, ourselves, not society, not partners, not anyone else, we take on the identity of a failure. As if it's this like characteristic, a trait that we start to identify as. And that's where we get stuck. We start to take on this ownership of being a failure. And a lot of it has to do with how we view failure, how it's perceived in our culture, right? This idiotic hustle culture and what Infogram has created is far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Of course, that was not the intended purpose, but this is what we call an unintended consequence. When we look at the totality of our journey, whether we're months or years into it, whether we have children or not, we tend to look at the journey only through the lens of the outcomes, because that's how society and culture tells us we should and do measure success. We kind of zoom out and get caught up in the day-to-day of how long we have to go, how still, and it feels so defeating. We think about how long it's been, how there's seemingly no end in sight, maybe how it feels like we're still or always at square one. It doesn't feel like it's happening fast enough. There's an impatience and, dare I say, an entitlement around finally getting pregnant, finally bringing that baby home. And until that happens, we are a failure. We have failed. Our bodies have failed. This is a huge reason why we often feel like our lives are on pause, like we're stuck, because so much of our mental energy and focus is being taken up by all of the thoughts that we get caught up with and in on how far we have to go. It takes our minds away from the small, beautiful moments that are happening in the present right now. This also comes up when we see birth and pregnancy announcements. Yeah, I know for me, when I would see those in those first few years, that was yet another reminder of how much of a failure I was. Look, they got it right, and I failed yet again. We could talk for hours about how our brains like to remind us of our failures, how triggers remind us, how much evidence we can collect to support our BS belief systems that we are failures. But let me tell you what's really happening. Most of the time, when we feel like failures, it's because there is a belief system in there that what you want to happen might not ever actually happen. Now, I know some or most of you are like, nah, I know that someday I'm going to be pregnant. I know that someday I'm going to be a mom. Yes, I believe that too. But I also had this nagging, pestering white noise of a thought that would come up and say, yeah, no, you won't. That's probably not going to happen for us. This is very normal. This is what's called cognitive dissonance. I've probably talked about it before, but it's holding two contradictory thoughts or emotions at the same time. This can be a blessing, and sometimes it kicks us in the ass, just like this scenario. The low hum of, yeah, it's probably not going to happen for us, is what creates the shame around being a failure, right? That's the identity part, because that's what we're really talking about. Shame. Shaming yourself for something you have very little, if any, control over. Remember what I said earlier. When we take on the badge of infertility as if it was a personal characteristic, that is always a breeding ground for shame. When we create an identity around something, it is always a breeding ground for shame. Now, notice the thought is, it probably won't work, right? It's not absolute. It's kind of fuzzy. It's kind of undecided, but it's also kind of decided. All of us have these unconscious belief systems lurking around, screwing with our heads. There's nothing wrong with that. It's incredibly human. Our job is to become aware of them and decide on purpose, with intention, how we want to think about them. Is it okay to sometimes tell yourself, maybe it won't happen for us? Yeah. You're human. It doesn't mean you don't want it. It means that there is a huge part of you that is scared. And that fear is coming out in that phrase, almost like an author giving context to a story. And maybe yours comes out in the form of a question, right? Maybe we won't ever have kids. What if I'm never a mom? Maybe my body is inhospitable to a baby. When we ask ourselves a seemingly innocuous question like that, I think of it as like pretty poison. It doesn't seem bad on the outside. Maybe it feels like genuine curiosity. But really, questions like that are a sneaky way your brain tries to cushion the blow of the real thought. It's like softening what you're actually thinking. Because the real thought is probably much more like, we won't ever have kids. I won't ever be a mom. My body is not hospitable to a baby. Here's a great exercise. If your brain is offering you a question, or a question that you might ask yourself or the universe at all the time, right? Something that comes up over and over and over, write it down and then change it from a question to a statement. And that's what you're really thinking. Okay, so we've gotten so much more awareness around this idea of failure, what it is, which is shame. It's a sneaky way of the brain to figure out kind of a path around to blame yourself, right? Again, shame. We're not talking about other people's opinions. It doesn't matter how many other people around us get knocked up. Calling yourself a failure is a mental warfare that you are engaging with yourself. There is no universal procedure manual for how having a family is supposed to go. We think there is because of the images that have been curated around us. But if 1 in 6 of us globally are not physically able to follow the said procedure, then we're sure as shit need to go to the HR department to draft a new one, because that's like 17% of the workforce cannot physically do the job. So maybe it's not the problem of the 17%. Just maybe. I don't know. I don't want to get too crazy, but maybe it's possible that there's an unrealistic media and cultural curation of what it looks like rather than, acknowledging the reality. But I digress. I'll take on social media one more day. Now let's talk about what to do when you find yourself in this failure mentality. Number 1, recognize you're doing it. Awareness, awareness, awareness. I swear to God, you guys could probably come up with a drinking game where you either drink when I say awareness or compassion, but don't do that. You might die. We can't fix what we don't look at. When you notice that you are name calling yourself or calling yourself a failure, that's like a giant glowing red indicator light that you need to take a beat. Like physically stop what you're doing. Now, here's what you can do. You can do a couple of different things. You can do them both. It doesn't matter. It's totally up to you. The first option is to interrogate the hell out of that thought. What exactly am I failing? If that is all your brain offers you is a bunch of supposed tos, shoulds, have tos, any of that crap, you will know right then and there that is social and cultural messaging that put that thought in your head, and it's not actually you talking. In fact, that could be your gating criteria for any thought you really want to take a look at. If it sounds like a should or any of its variables, then you know that that thought did not come from you. You did not originate that thought, and therefore you do not owe that thought any more airtime. Even telling yourself, oh, whoa, babe, we don't should on ourselves anymore. That's not what happens here. You are just reaffirming to yourself you will always have your own back. The second option is to reframe the thought. This is taking the thought that you're making mean something about you and getting it much more specific. So instead of my beta was negative, I failed. My beta was negative. I did everything I knew to do. I'm heartbroken that I didn't get the outcome I desperately wanted. Do you see the difference? There's no rainbows, there's no daisies, there's no fake positivity crap. You're taking time to acknowledge that you are hurting, that you didn't get what you hoped for, and that is disappointing and heartbreaking. And you're letting it be those things without it also being your fault. The podcast episode Clean versus Dirty Pain, I think it's somewhere in the first 10-ish episodes, I think. And you would do really well to get a refresh on that if it's been a minute since you've listened, or if you're kind of just jumping into the podcast right now, go back and listen to that. I want you to check that episode out. We don't have to make these heartbreaks our fault, because they're not. We didn't do anything wrong. We didn't fail at anything. That cheeseburger you ate last week, or the beer or glass of wine that you had at the start of your stims, or taking or not taking supplements, that's not what happened. It's not your fault. If it's not your fault, it's not a failure. I know you want something to blame. Something you can point your finger at and say, yes, this is why my heart is broken. But so often in life, the absolute yeses in infertility, they don't exist. And so when we have that absence of certainty, that absence of absolute, we turn that need to blame something on ourselves. It's completely unnecessary. You can be heartbroken and it not be your fault. You can be devastated and it's not because of something you did. Because as my incredible reproductive endocrinologist told me when we first started working together 4.5 years ago, for a cycle or transfer to fail and it to be that person's fault would require a tremendous amount of intention or a tremendous amount of neglect. Now, I've met many women on an infertility and fertility treatment journey over the past decade, and none of them have ever intentionally tried to sabotage their chances. Nor have they been so neglectful of their role in the process that their neglect directly caused a failure. Now, we can forget things. Oh my God, in the 2 cycles and 3 transfers that I have done, you do not want to know how many times I have forgotten a dose of medication. Not the injectables. Well, no, that's not true. Once went out of town without my Lupron and I missed a dose, and then I waited all day at an area pharmacy to get it refilled. But oh my God, I'm really bad at taking pills. But that's because I'm human. Not because I wanted it to fail, not because I was so neglectful that I created an opportunity of, say, that transfer to fail. Sometimes we do forget things. And you know what? It doesn't mean that we failed. We course correct, we pivot, we figure it out. You already do those things. You're already amazing at that. Imagine what you could do if you dropped the BS story that you're a failure. How much freer would you get to feel, my friend? That is what I want for you, each and every one of you. Okay, that is what I have for you today. Have a beautiful week, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.